Have you ever spent 10 minutes pre-teaching vocabulary only to realize your students didn't actually need most of those words? Pre-teaching vocabulary reading and listening lessons has become almost automatic in many language classrooms, but should we always do it? Or are there times when it's actually better to let learners encounter new words for the first time in the text itself? By the end of this video, I'll share a simple framework that can help you decide when pre-teaching vocabulary is likely to help and when it might be better not to. Hi, I'm Raffaella Manza, founder of ProTEFL Institute, where I support English teachers through lesson planning, methodology consultations and teacher training. And on this channel, we explore the thinking behind effective teaching. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear. I'm not against pre-teaching vocabulary. There are good reasons for doing it. Maybe you want to reduce cognitive overload. Maybe you don't want learners to become frustrated. Maybe there is a key concept without which the whole text simply doesn't make sense. Those are all perfectly valid reasons. The problem isn't pre-teaching vocabulary. The problem is doing it automatically because a word looks difficult and not because we've decided learners actually need it before the task. Before asking which words should I teach, I think we need to ask another question first. What's the objective of this lesson? If today's lesson is reading, my objective isn't vocabulary, it's helping learners become better readers. If today's lesson is listening, my objective isn't vocabulary either. It's helping learners become better listeners. Vocabulary is there to support that objective, not to replace it. And that's important because every minute I spend explaining vocabulary, it's 1 minute I'm not spending helping students develop the skill I actually wanted to teach. Every teaching decision has an opportunity cost. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, but what if my students don't understand the text? But let me ask you another one. Do students really need to understand every single word? Or do they simply need to understand enough to complete a task? Those are two very different things. One of the most valuable reading and listening skills we can help learners develop is the ability to deal with a known language, to use context, to make intelligent guesses, to tolerate a little uncertainty. If we remove every unfamiliar word before students even start, we may also be removing the opportunity to develop those skills. So, when is pre-teaching actually worth it? For me, there are only a few situations when it's genuinely worth doing. The first is when a word blocks comprehension. Imagine your students are reading a text about mountain rescues. If they don't know what an avalanche is, understanding the text might become much more difficult. Or perhaps the listening task is about buying a house and the key concept is a mortgage. Again, that's probably worth clarifying first. The second situation is when students need a word simply to understand the task itself. If an essential word appears in the instructions or in the comprehension questions, clarifying it removes an unnecessary obstacle. Everything else deserves a second thought. And in another video, I'll show you exactly how I decide whether a word is genuinely blocking, because it's not always as obvious as it seems. When I first started teaching, I didn't stop with the blocking words. I taught almost everything, and looking back, I think I created 3 new problems. First, I spent far too much time talking. The reading lesson became teacher-centered before students had even looked at the text. Second, the vocabulary had no context. Students hadn't read or listened yet. So the words were just isolated items on the board, random, disconnected. It's much harder to remember vocabulary when it has nothing to attach itself to. And finally, many of those words weren't even worth teaching. They were low-frequency words students were unlikely to use again. So I was spending valuable classroom time teaching vocabulary that wasn't helping me achieve the objective of the lesson. But choosing which words deserve classroom time isn't the end of the decision-making process. Once you've identified a word that's worth teaching, there are still two important decisions to make. How much attention does that word actually need? And when is the best moment to teach it? Let's start with the first one. Deciding that a word deserves attention doesn't automatically mean turning it into a full vocabulary lesson. If learners only need to recognize it in order to understand the text, then a brief explanation or a picture may be enough. But if they're expected to use that word later in speaking or in writing, that's a different objective. Now, let's look at the second question. Before students read or listen, or afterwards? Personally, unless a word genuinely blocks the students from understanding the main idea, I often prefer waiting until after students have completed a first gist task. Why? Well, before they meet the text, I'm only making predictions. I think a word might be difficult, I think students might need it, but I don't actually know. They may already know it. They may work it out from the context, or they may not need it at all. After the gist task, I know much more. I can see which words genuinely prevented comprehension, which ones the students worked out from the context, and which one weren't actually a problem. So instead of teaching vocabulary based on my assumptions, I'm responding to what actually happened in the classroom. That's only one reason. The real reason is context. By the time students have completed a gist task, they already have something they didn't have 5 minutes earlier. Context. They know what the text is about, they know the people involved, they know the situation. They've already started building an overall understanding of the message. We don't normally understand a text by decoding every single word first. Instead, we'll build an initial understanding of the whole. Then, we use that understanding to interpret individual words. And those words help us refine our understanding of the whole. It's a continuous process. Sometimes students need vocabulary to understand the text, but sometimes they need the text to understand the vocabulary. There is one final reason I like waiting. It protects the purpose of the first task. If my first task is to understand the general ideas, I don't want students focusing on every unfamiliar word. I want them asking, what's happening? Who's speaking? What's the main idea? Because that's the skill I'm trying to develop. In real life, we don't stop every time we meet an unfamiliar word. We use the title, our background knowledge, the surrounding sentences. Sometimes we infer the meaning. Sometimes we realize the word isn't actually important. Sometimes we simply keep reading or listening because we already understand enough. Those are reading and listening strategies. If this video has given you something to think about, the next question is just as important. How do you decide whether a word is actually blocking? That's exactly what we'll explore in the next video. So if you don't want to miss it, make sure you're subscribed and see you in the next one.